Hello, and we're back in TerraTech today. Going to be showing off, at least as of the time of this recording, my latest hovercraft, the Machete. Kind of putting it through its paces, doing something that I like to call the 10K test. And that is when I load it into Creative, and essentially have it go 10,000 units in one direction. I'm going to pick north this time, just because I can. And that's just to kind of see how well it works, how well it handles against various terrain, various enemies. And one of the rules I like to set for the 10K test is fight everything on the way that shows up. No skipping enemies, on purpose at least. So first off, the Machete is meant mostly as a kind of just generic combat hover that can sustain itself through its refineries and built-in power generators. So let's get this thing going. It's a little light on total battery capacity, but it can recharge itself extremely quickly because it has 6 GSO mobile furnace generators. I believe it's 6. Let's check. Okay, I was wrong. 8. Yeah. So it's essentially got 2 different hover heights that I would at least recommend you stay at. There's the more battle mode height, where the lift is set to 100, so you can make use of the missile launchers in the bottom. And then there is the standard default height, which is perfect for collecting resources. And wow, that one just popped. Huh, okay, moving on. So it's got a cruising speed of about 73, 74 miles an hour. And with boosters, it can go up to about 93-ish. But I'm not going to be using the boosters too much because then it's too easy to just zip right through it and miss all the enemies. Okay. Really hope that eventually the TerraTech devs make the creative hard enemies actually hard. Because there's way too many unshielded, not even repair bubbled techs. Cruising along. No real issues with terrain. Thanks to the pretty high ride height. It's got a bunch of the Geocorp hovers, which have the highest ride height of any of the hover plates, especially when you're using throttled lift to essentially mitigate a lot of the weight. So even though this thing's mostly Hawkeye, the hover pads have no problems. I wonder. Let's see. I wonder if this thing can actually climb this. use the arrow keys for pitch control, or even roll, but there's no reason to use roll here. We're just going to... Oh, look at that. So it can anchor. It does have a couple solar panels. They're barely enough to even have it do its startup sequence for the bubbles. It's mostly just energy maintenance if you're not going to be using it for a little while. Because the main source of power is meant to be the mobile furnace generator. Almost missed an enemy. Come back here. Ow. Yep. Okay. Moving on. So yeah, once we get through this, I'll strip this thing a little bit, let you guys see some of the insides for the actual internal factory and stuff. You can see the delivery cannons poking out the back. I like to use them exhaust, like faking like it's an exhaust or something. Yeah, we found some salt flats. No. Let's see if we can get some more burnable resources here. So you'll also notice not a single one of those burnable resources got sold. That's because all of the furnace generators are on the conveyor before it gets to the delivery cannons. Unlike some of my other builds where it's got a very, very small factory inside, this one actually has proper conveyors. So we're a little over halfway through our 10K test. Ooh, yeah, I found the pillars biome. Nice. Don't usually find that on these. Alright, let's see if it can go up this one without using tilt. Awesome. So I like to do that kind of test just to make sure I've got enough hover strength, kind of more towards the front of the craft here. Because if you have the hovers in like a central location but not on the front or back, first off it makes it a lot more difficult for the gyro to keep it balanced, but it also means whenever you're coming up against any kind of ground, if the hovers aren't enough forward, backward, left, or right, they won't be able to respond fast enough to actually catch the tech and keep it from running into the ground. Guy doesn't show up on the radar. No, he's just too far away. Let's get a bit more fuel here, and we're going to be on our merry way. Also, unlike some of my more recent hovers, this one does not use the hover bug at all. That's the downside to using a... It's 70 something miles an hour isn't exactly super fast, but it's fast enough that most of the enemy will be spawning behind us, unfortunately. Definitely one of the easier 10k tests I've had. None of the enemies have been really threatening. Then again, this thing costs about 1.8 million, and honestly, once you start going into the million plus range, none of the enemies that spawn are really a threat unless you're in campaign mode fighting against an invader. And even then, only if you let them actually get their bubbles up and stuff, since they don't spawn in with all their bubbles already activated. Let's take care of this little guy. Then, and of course, it's going to be nighttime. Figures. So, that's about what I do for a 10k test. Let's strip off some of the side stuff here so you can actually see some of these internals for the factory. And the cabs. So what we have, excuse me, what we have is a GSO flatbed collector, which is my personal favorite collector, since I believe it still has the longest range of any collector, which makes it great for picking up resources on relatively high flying flyers or hovers. And in order to have the resources automatically go from any collector to a conveyor, it needs to have either a filter or an alternator. I prefer the alternator because it doesn't have this always on UI element of, oh, it's filtering everything kind of stuff. And it also allows you to immediately have a corner instead of having to go straight out and then wherever you need to go. It goes up, it goes into a silo, and that silo is connected to a refinery, which feeds back into the silo itself. So that way it doesn't have to worry about missing chunks or whatever as things are going past. And then the chunks will only get through if it's a refined item. Now this does mean that if for whatever reason you had your base and you tried to clean it up and you had components in it, this factory would get clogged by that. So something to keep in mind, but honestly the chances of having to deal with that are pretty low. Anyway, so it gets refined, spits back, and gets put back into the silo. Once the blocks are refined, it gets sent down one of two output lanes, each one hooked up to 4 GSO mobile furnace generators, and then if none of the generators pick it up, then they get sold in the delivery cannons. For my more combat-oriented techs, I like to use the Hawkeye cabs just because they have the most amount of health. And again, it's this one in particular, trying to figure out the best way to build with these mega reactor batteries. I like them a lot. They're great. They've got ridiculous capacity on top of the fact that they don't explode and damage everything nearby when they get blown up. It's kind of crazy. Like, best capacity and they don't explode. It's a little ridiculous. And also, when you're building a hovercraft specifically with a factory on it, you want to make sure you have your hover pads far enough away from your collectors and the rest of the factory bits, because the resources traveling will interact with your hover pads. So even this is probably a little close. It's just I don't have a ton of space to work with, unfortunately, since I made it relatively compact. So sometimes when this thing's picking up resources, they'll get dragged across the hover pad, and the hover pad will react to it, thinking that, oh look, there's suddenly ground there. But yeah, that's a bit of an inside look at some of my testing processes that I go through when I'm building these things before I post them. And also just, I guess, more build tips and stuff for building hovers and whatnot in TerraTech. Hope it helps and hope you have a great day. Take care.